What if it were possible to access other lands beyond our own? How would we go about doing it? What would be the means in which we could reach these lands? Would we reach them physically, metaphysically, or through some other means, some world apparatus that opens portals? And what would these lands be like? Would we discover a utopia, something that resembles heaven? Or would we discover a terrifying hell, an existence that rendered us blind? So many different possibilities in exploring the lands beyond our own, wonders and terrors beyond the ability of words to describe. And yet we see certain signs within the lands that we do know and we have accessed that indicate that these possibilities might be more real than we like to imagine. Join me today as we explore journeys to the lands beyond. City of Norilska, yet another one of these cities that's located in the far north on a layer of permafrost built in the 1930s during the Soviet regime at the time. And it reflects one of many unique mysteries and anomalies that we have in the lost Arctic land. We have beautiful and incredible landscapes, and yet legends of creatures and cryptids that may inhabit the area. Why is it that this area continues to be so mysterious to us, and why is it that we don't simply have very direct answers about it? Many will say, well, we do have direct answers, even with legends of creatures that carry off children. Come join me as we explore the lost Arctic land. A lot of confusion of the Arctic stems from the maps that we have of the Arctic, and I'll explain the use of the term Arctica in a moment. Our current Google Earth shows us that it's a frozen ocean. Yet looking at the city of Norilska here in northern Russia, we have a planned community from the 1930s during the Soviet era. This was part of the Gulag system, where people were sent for forced labor, and yet they managed to build a city. Would it surprise you to know this is still a controlled city? And yet going from this controlled city where there's controlled access, in other words, you have to have government permission to settle there and visit, we go to Canada, where we have Prince of Wales Fort, a star fort that was constructed in the 1700s to protect the fur trade. So another interesting anomaly as this being the northernmost fort in Canada and in North America, off of Hudson Bay. And would you be surprised to know that its military effectiveness was limited? In fact, it was completely ineffective at resisting a naval invasion. We'll also take a look at Station Nord in Greenland. Greenland's been in the news a lot lately because, for some reason, it's a very strategically important piece of land. And this is not a recent development, it's always been strategically important. We'll even take a look at Thule, or Thule, depending on how you want to pronounce it today, and the U.S. military presence that's been very interesting in Greenland. Looking at the Urbano Monte map, a map that was published in Milan, coincidentally, in 1587, and recently discovered and published and made available through the various archives, including the David Rumsey collection, we see that it shows that there was actually a landmass at what we think of as the North Pole or the Arctic Circle. Lands that are very clearly not there. Now, the strange orientation of Greenland on this map notwithstanding, Urbano Monte was considered an individual who wanted to draw an entire planisphere. In other words, map all of the known lands. He was evidently inspired to do this by a Japanese delegation that was visiting Milan in the 1500s. How interesting, isn't it? Yes, that's what official history tells us. Why does it always seem to me like official history has minor alterations in it? Perhaps that's just my perspective. But then, of course, we look at the famous Mercator map, where, again, we have areas of land that are depicted at the North Pole. Now, were all these cartographers just mistaken? Were they reading false reports? Or were they just passing on a myth? We think of the North Pole today, or the Arctic region, as being an area of polar bears and lots of ice flows. And as you saw on the Google map or the Google Earth depiction, it's just that. It's just an ocean that tends to freeze over. And some of the maps that we have, even from earlier time frames, do seem to corroborate this perception. You see here in this particular map, we do have an ocean. It's called the Northern Ocean. And there's really nothing there, and it just freezes over at particular time frames. Although we do have other accounts that indicate that there does seem to be something more there. Could it have been that there was something there completely different in the distant past? Think also about the use of the terminology of Arctica. Arctica officially is a legendary piece of land that was there 2 billion years ago. Or perhaps we shouldn't say it was legendary, it was hypothetical. This shows us the reduction of the ice flow in the Arctic Ocean. And yet, oddly enough, we have difficulty finding more images that show us exactly what this area looks like. One would think that with all of our satellites and aerial imagery available, we could at least put together a better overall picture of what the Arctic looks like. But perhaps there's limitations that we're just simply not aware of. Isn't this intriguing? Here we have the North Pole, the North Magnetic Pole, and the Pole of Inaccessibility. Interesting terminology there that we have on that. I just thought I would share that. Many sweeping landscapes, though, in the lands that surround the Arctic area or the Arctic region. Are the polar regions truly forbidden, or is it just limited controlled access? Is there a legitimate scientific reason for that, or is it simply because there's curiosity? There's also the interesting connection that we have of the northern Russian area that we tend not to explore or overlook, quite frankly. And it's also connected to the northern areas that we have in Canada and Alaska and the Scandinavian nations. There's the interesting situation with Nova Zemlya, the archipelago that is north of North Russia, running into the Arctic Circle. Yes, an archipelago, much in the same way that New Zealand is an archipelago. And yet we have the same challenges with the maps, that this was a discovered area, and yet someone didn't seem to know exactly where the landmass ran. The odd maps that make it very difficult to ascertain where the land ends and the ocean begins. And yet there were numerous expeditions by other nations, not just Russia, to attempt to explore this area. Now, of course, we know that Norway, according to the official history, is the ultimate master of discovering and exploring both the poles. But some of the early maps of Nova Zemlya are quite intriguing, because once again they do give that interesting depiction that this is a land that had many communities, indeed an entire civilization on it that resulted in a first contact with the explorers at the time. It's part of the mixed history that we have that shows different perceptions that either the history is actually capturing accurately, or perhaps it's been reinterpreted or changed over time. Now, I'm not suggesting a conspiracy with this particular archipelago, merely that it's fascinating that there are different depictions and different perceptions of what its actual existence is. It's another one of those, how shall we say, mysterious places, and perhaps recent events have served to make it rather mysterious. Even the satellite images, or the aerial images, depending on how we delineate between the two, always seem to show that it might not necessarily be an archipelago, that it does seem to be one continuous landmass, even though there is stated to be a strait right through it. It's also the location where the largest thermonuclear detonation and the largest man-made explosion in the history of the world occurred, the Tsar Bomba, 57 megatons, a shock wave that went around the planet 3 times. Again, if you accept those explanations. And that's what the official history tells us happened. But it's rather intriguing to me that this massive detonation was a weapon that was apparently unusable and was merely a demonstration of the explosive capabilities at the time. Here is the crater on Nova Zemlya, and this still remains a nuclear test site apparently to this day, although how active it is and what's really happening, I don't know. And I'll also state that no, I was not present when the Tsar Bomba was detonated, so I don't know about the details behind it. I have the images in the official release. Now, apparently, U.S. authorities did corroborate the fact that there was indeed the most powerful nuclear detonation in this area, and that it's been used for many other nuclear tests over time. But there's other intriguing mysteries in northern Russia that's not too far off from Nova Zemlya. Again, this is a very strange area with many mysteries. Looking at the official history, though, of how Russia actually explored the Siberian area and northern Russia are quite intriguing as well. We notice that there's certain parallels with the way that the United States was explored with the original explorers. Now, I merely say certain parallels in the fact that similar events occurred. The official history tells us that these events were vastly separated. Encounters of these explorers with very unique native people with very different customs and varied languages. Quite intriguing accounts at that as well, because why is it that we have native people who have so many different customs and so many different languages? It's as though languages can just develop on the fly. You have a single group of people that crossed the Bering Strait and became what is today known as the Native Americans across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and yet they developed many different languages, many different customs. I suppose it's possible. I just find the whole thing very intriguing. And going back to northern Russia and the unique cities that we have and the monuments to the gulags, what really was going on up there at that time? The 1930s seems to have been a very questionable time regardless of where we are in the land, whether we're in the United States, Russia, Soviet Union, anywhere in Europe, and all the different political entities that seem to come into existence and then fade away. It's interesting how it seems to be analogous to the concept of the way corporations have different names and change ownership and so on and so forth. But the incredible natural landscape of the Arctic area endures to this day. And this very compelling mystery that we have of these encounters with these unique indigenous people. Now, was this actually an entirely different civilization that was being encountered up here? Were these other remnants of some forgotten civilization? Well, the official history says that these were merely isolated groups of people, that they were nomadic tribes people who had their own customs, but they certainly hadn't developed any sort of civilization. That's what the official history says. Why is it that there are particular isolated areas that seem to be used in a controlled manner, whether it's for what we're informed are nuclear detonations? Although I have to ask the question, is there something else going on up there? Is there a reason why we have this rather unique architecture that seems to blend with our current understanding of architecture? If you're going to build a city in a permafrost area, you're probably going to be limited in terms of what you could establish for a foundation. That's what one would expect. But there are examples, such as Norliska, where we have rather incredible structures. Now, I have not been there personally. I've never obtained government permission to actually go there and assess these structures, but I am rather amazed that such structures like this do exist in northern latitudes, because we would expect the challenge of not just the weather, but the permafrost layer would be a limiting factor on establishing a deep enough foundation to allow structures like this to endure over time. But once again, I certainly don't want to discredit the individuals that really constructed them. Somebody pulled it off. Somebody did these explorations. But that's part of the enduring mystery, the lost Arctic land, because while we tend to focus our efforts down in the Antarctica, we have to recall that the Arctic seems to be just as mysterious. Thinking on this planned city that was established in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, for internees, for political prisoners, the entire Gulag system, being a very brutal and terrifying system and forced internment, where people were sent to work until they died, or they were simply separated from the civilization and the society at that time. Yet, strangely enough, this entire mentality continues to endure to this day, but we're given justifications for it. There are rather impressive structures here at this vast northern location, structures that are very advanced churches and seem to show more advanced architecture than we'd expect to see. Now, apparently, some of these impressive locations are just that. They are considered tourist displays, and as I've said, I've not been on the ground here personally to assess these structures. I will say that they look very impactful looking at the images, and they do have that artistic beauty that we'd expect to see in the old world. Are they actually surviving old world structures? Are they merely renovated old world structures? Or are they really just some sort of tourist representation that's built up there to draw the people? It's really difficult to actually explore northern Russia in a lot of ways because of the vast expanses of land and the fact that there are many different areas that still have controlled access to this day. So I suppose it's not any different than any one of these other unique areas that we've tried to explore, tried to look at. But the fact that mysteries endure and the fact that physical access is difficult, and when I say physical access is difficult, that could just simply be to the weather difficulties or the climate that you're going to encounter up there. And here, as we look at this overview of Nova Zemlya, we can see the strait that's displayed on the map, although when you look at the aerial imagery or the satellite imagery, it gives you the impression that it is a continuous island and not an archipelago. And here we have the northernmost mosque in the land. Yes, Norliska has a mosque in it, and a very well-constructed mosque, including a minaret, at least according to the image. The layout of this city is very intriguing. Is it possible that this city is some remnant from a previous civilization that was discovered and then repurposed in the 1930s? Or was it really a city that was simply built on the hard labor of political prisoners that was sent there, or that were sent there to their own demise because of the fact that they'd gone against the regime at that time. Well, there's many different perceptions in terms of what really happened at that time, and it's still a very difficult time frame in history to really grasp. Yes, we have another one of these impressive cathedrals, the Alexander Nevsky Church or Cathedral, because that always seems to be the name for a building that looks like this, whether it's in Bulgaria, Siberia, or northern Russia. It's very interesting to note the architecture is exactly like what we've seen. There's also the other mystery that in Imperial Russia, they even started experimenting with submarines. And the only reason I bring that up is because of the fact that the operations of the Russian Navy were located in vast northern latitudes. And you might be surprised to know, if you do a little historical research, that apparently the Imperial Russian Navy dabbled about in submarine technology from officially the 1830s and the 1850s. They had some successful designs. Oddly enough, about the exact same time that the United States Navy and other navies across the land were experimenting in submarines. I guess they were just all the rage at the time. Although to this day, there's still the questionable tactical use of submarines. How useful are they? How fast are they underwater? What are their true capabilities? I'm certainly not an expert in naval warfare, but the fact is that we still have submarines, and they still apparently play a very important role in the nuclear triad. In other words, the various means of delivering nuclear weapons. Although recall, nuclear weapons are simply to be used as a deterrent. Looking at some of the other images, though, of the lost Arctic lands, we get the impression of rather exotic locations. There's also the recurring theme that we have of expeditions going all over these Arctic lands, and whether we're looking for the North Pole, the Northwest Passage, the Northeast Passage, or wonderful natural resources that may be up there, we have these numerous historical records of lost expeditions. The Franklin expedition, the Ross expedition, many other difficulties in trying to explore these lands. And then, of course, the near-legendary status of the encounters with these indigenous people. But yet you look at some of the images, the preserved photographs from the historical archives, and it gives you the impression that this was a very historical, momentous occasion. You would think that at this point in time, after all this exploration going on for hundreds of years, the conflict, or the Great Frontier War, as it was called in the United States, the Circassian War, or the Caucasian War, as it was called in Russia in the 1800s, that at that point in time, encounters with indigenous people would just simply be viewed as a real nuisance from the government at that point in time. Yet it seems to be documented as though it was a first contact opportunity. Very intriguing. Looking at other locations such as Vladivostok, which again we had a very impressive Allied intervention after World War I, we see a more built up city than we'd expect to see. Very elaborate structures with blocks and incredible architectural knowledge that seem to have gone into it. We're going to be doing an exploration of Vladivostok here in the near future. There's many areas that we could spend exploring in the Russian landscape to this day. And yet, even in the images and the accounts of the past, it does give us that very incredible and alluring desire to explore these areas, to try to understand and explain exactly what was in existence at that time. And yet, for whatever reason, we still have the same postcard mentality for Vladivostok that we have for others. And it should be noted that many of these cities do have more of a urban nightmare quality to them, as though these really are structures that were thrown up at the 11th hour, and this is what we'd expect to see, something that was constructed for Gulag prisoners or by Gulag prisoners. Yet it is a conflicting account with what we have of these other gorgeous structures, these beautiful buildings that seem to be in these remote, far-flung locations at distant northern latitudes, built on permafrost, something we'd expect it to be very difficult. We even have isolated island fortresses that exist in random locations. And whether we're talking about an island in Siberia or really an island anywhere else, why would anybody go to the trouble of building such an elaborate structure? What was really the purpose of this? Was this some sort of fortress? Was this some sort of apparatus or machine? Or was it just somebody who decided to waste their time when resources were not at a premium? Of course, as we understand it, people worked harder in the past, and there was every reason to establish these impressive defensive fortifications at very remote locations. I'm not exactly sure how that stands up to any sort of scrutiny, whether we're talking a tactical, operational, or strategic approach from the military mindset, but these structures do endure. We can't really explain them. They seem to be ruins of something else, and yet the default explanation, and as we always have the tombs and temples for the ancient world, is that it's a military fortification of some sort, and it was forgotten over a period of time. yet this is a very isolated military fortification. And we think of other ones that we've looked at, whether we're talking about Fort Jefferson off of Florida or elaborate star forts that are in isolated locations. And on that note, I thought we'd take a look at the Prince of Wales fort that's in northern Canada off of Hudson Bay. Yes, this very impressive fort that was actually built up to a stone standard in the 1700s. And the reason that this was done was to protect the fur trade at that point in time. The fur trade by the Hudson Bay Company, facilitated by Great Britain, the United Kingdom, after winning the 7 Years' War, in which it had taken over Canada and all the fur trade from France. And there was an elaborate plan to build this fort. Originally it was a wooden fort, but then it was upgraded to a stone fort. And of course, whenever we see a star fort, we have to ask questions that are associated with this. This Prince of Wales fort is very intriguing in Canada because of its very remote location. And what was it really defending? The other question I have is that this fort still exists to this day. However, the official history tells us that during the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, when the United States was breaking away from Great Britain, there was apparently a French naval expedition that was sent up here to Hudson Bay, 3 ships, to raid and disrupt the fur trade. And this French naval expedition managed to easily capture this fort. Although it should be noted that this fort was only manned by 39 personnel, all of them non-military, and the governor. And they didn't really put up a struggle against the French Marines that had shown up in their 3 ships. So you go to all the trouble to build this very incredible stone fort, but then you don't bother to garrison it with any soldiers. How interesting. Again, it goes back to that saying, fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of humanity. Or, if you're not going to garrison something, it's not going to be effective, so why go to all the trouble to building this elaborate and remote star fort? We do have other images that indicate that it has eroded to quite an extent, perhaps from the 1920s, 1930s. Although, are these images of this same fort, or is it something else? This is definitely something I'd like to explore on the ground because we seem to have multiple accounts. How much of it's been renovated, how much of it's been replaced or readorned over time. What have been the changes to what this original military fortification was supposed to be? And there's even a statement that the French, after they captured the fort, tried to reduce or to destroy it, and they were unable to destroy it. How intriguing. And even the fur trade that they disrupted, eventually it went away on its own. So once again, conflicting accounts, military efforts that don't seem to make a lot of sense, and all these resources being flung into a remote area, but then not bothering to garrison it with any soldiers, and therefore it was easily captured. So once again, we have yet another historical account of a star fort that was militarily ineffective. Now, we would expect that the star fort is being built to resist the effort of cannons because that's the reason that we had star forts. You could say that, well, maybe they built it like this to resist Native Americans or indigenous tribes from raiding them, but what would you need a star fort for? And of course, we think of the other story that we have of the Great Battle of Detroit, where General Hull surrendered without firing a shot. Of course, he actually had an army and soldiers. There's even this strange Tower of the Prince of Wales. Now, this is located in Nova Scotia, still in Canada, albeit located far away from Hudson Bay, but a very interesting structure. It even has a nice plaque that tells you exactly what it's all about. Now, is that really the origin of the structure? You don't really hear much of these incredible towers that they just randomly built all over the place for, once again, defensive fortifications or purposes. There's also the other intriguing mystery of cryptids or strange beings that are located all over in this Arctic area. Numerous accounts that say that these encounters have occurred in these isolated areas. Now, we have no shortage of different cryptids or strange beings or whatever you want to refer to them as, things that have not been cataloged by the current scientific community. Are they giant serpents? Do they present some sort of threat? Are they just simply from the imagination of people? Even strange beings that seem to wander the land and are even called strangers. Dark beings that seem to be observing humans for whatever reason. Far-flung settlements in northern Canada, with odd accounts of creatures being seen in different locations. Now, these may simply be myths, these may simply be the product of some sort of mass hysteria, but for whatever reason, these accounts of these encounters just don't ever seem to go away. there's always newer ones that seem to give some more validity to the possibility of these extraordinary forms of life. There are also the facts that we do have forms of life thought to be extinct, or other creatures that were thought not to be in existence that were eventually verified by scientific authorities. So I guess it just depends on your perspective. But there's all these stories, myths, accounts of giant serpents that are in these freshwater areas, these enduring accounts of these strange creatures such as the Wendigos, or the many other ways to pronounce them, these strange creatures that come from indigenous tribal legends and from the legends of Native Americans, and even the very strange and terrifying creatures that exist on the very fringe of the frontier in northern Canada, known to carry off the children of the indigenous people at that time if they wander too far. Is this just some sort of local legend to scare people, or is there some more validity with this? Is this something of a terror that we don't fully understand? Are there forces at work in these remote areas that we don't truly comprehend, or we are simply unaware of, that they continue to threaten us? And that's why we have these overlapping possibilities of realities, different existences in the same physical location that could bring about these incredible supernatural creatures and beings that are not human. I was always intrigued by the fact that just about every single freshwater area has some sort of legend of a serpent or a creature that lives in it. Is that just simply to attract tourism? Well, if everybody's doing it, then where are you going to go? Am I going to go see Tahoe Tessie, or am I going to go see the Loch Ness Monster? I guess it just depends where I am. But it seems to me that there is something more to these accounts, and whether these creatures are active and you can still get a glimpse of them, or whether they're just the product of legends, remain to be seen. Bidefuk Space Base. Yes. Going to Greenland, where we seem to have all this recent focus on what is so strategically important about Greenland. Greenland, which is depicted in different ways in the older maps, different orientations. The United States has had quite a presence in Greenland, especially since World War II, when Denmark, the current and continuing sovereign owner of the land of Greenland, requested the United States to defend Greenland after they fell from the German invasion in World War II. And throughout the Cold War and to this day, the United States has maintained a definitive military presence in Greenland. Now, we understand that during the Cold War, it was a very critical early warning and strategic base where the United States operated the Strategic Bomber Force out of. There was even a famous crash of a B-52 near what was called Tully Air Base at the time, or Thul if you want to pronounce it exactly as it's spelled. But it's been renamed and no longer an Air Force base, it is now a Space Force base, one that just fortuitously has some very interesting terrain about it. And I'm always reminded of the fact that Greenland was considered a real estate scam, that the real place everyone wanted to go and inhabit was Iceland, but not Greenland. But now all of a sudden, here in the 21st century, we have all this focus on Greenland again. And during World War II and throughout the Cold War, we had a lot of focus on Greenland. And of course, it refers back to the reasons for strategic defense, but you have to ask, is there something else going on? There are many well-documented efforts by the United States Army to actually build an underground base within the ice of Greenland, Camp Sentry as it was called. And there's no shortages of images or efforts that were documenting this Herculean effort by the United States Army to establish this base. But why is there all this military importance that seems to be associated with this land that's in the Arctic? Certainly with the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles and now with hypersonic missiles, the defense imperative of this area would be limited, one would think. But for whatever reason, it continues to endure. And perhaps they're just things that we don't know and we're not supposed to know. But here you can see where Camp Sentry was located in relation to Tully Air Base at that time. And what was really the impetuousness of the United States Army to try to do this? Yes, we have our official explanations, but I'm not wondering if there's some other explanation for why to try to establish a base in the ice in Greenland. There's also other fictional accounts of how there were expeditions that occurred in the vast north, Ice Station Zebra, for example. There's even the long-running understanding of how long there's been a military importance for reconnaissance purposes with the bases in Greenland. So what exactly is really going on there? And how does it relate to this lost Arctic land that we have? The differing orientations that we have of Greenland. Is it north-south? Is it east-west? Why is it depicted as part of land that did exist in the North Pole on earlier maps? And why is it so amorphous? Those are lingering questions that we have. And of course now, if you're a collector of military apparel, you can certainly find the remaining patches of the old Tully Air Base, which it is no longer referred to as it's been renamed, becoming part of the Space Force, albeit still part of the Department of the United States Air Force. So as I'm fond of saying, make of it what you will. But there does seem to be a strategic importance, and it's still talked about quite frequently. And again, it's come up in the news time and time again. Now, the other base in Greenland that we're going to take a look at is Station Nord, a scientific station that is still maintained by Denmark to this day and located on the northeast corner, as we understand it, of Greenland. And really, we have the images that we'd expect to see, an icy tundra landscape that seems very inhospitable to human habitation. But it still exists, and it still seems to have some sort of importance. Now, from what we're informed, it's an importance of maintaining the weather and understanding what the weather patterns are. By the way, did you know that there was apparently a special trans convoy or a trans-world convoy that was trying to drive across both poles in vehicles? I don't know, maybe they just needed to get George Peppard. Apparently they had left from Canada, went through Yellowknife, and got all the way up to the North Pole, but then when they tried to go through Ice Station Nord, they were stopped by Danish authorities, who said that their little expedition was not safe. Yes, it reminds me of the ending of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where a couple cops show up and they stop this incredible trans-Arctic convoy from traversing it. Oddly enough, this was not very well documented, but this event did occur in 2014. And again, it shows the limitations of access to the lost Arctic lands. But what are your thoughts? What's really going on up here in the lost Arctic lands? Are there lands that we can't access, or is it all just a coincidence? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. The serenity and the beauty of the Great Lakes hides many secrets. And as you look over this very interesting rock face at the wonder of Lake Superior going off into the horizon, you could be understood to realize that there doesn't appear to be any sort of mystery here. It's a beautiful natural area. And yet the Great Lakes behind its veneer of beauty hides many mysteries. There are many strange occurrences, such as odd architecture with the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. There's also the fact that the Great Lakes don't appear on many early maps. Perhaps the cartographers were simply not aware of them. We have many shipping losses that have occurred in the Great Lakes throughout the years. Strange weather phenomenon. And one wouldn't expect that to be the case. Yet there's not a single graveyard in the Great Lakes. Every single one of the Great Lakes is a massive shipping graveyard. So what's exactly the situation here? Do we have strange weather patterns? Is it simply a place where perfect storms occur? We also have the presence of these very intriguing cities, such as Chicago or Shilaga on Lake Michigan. And least we forget Cleveland, another city that we've explored off Lake Erie. Many great cities and many strange phenomenon, along with Milwaukee. Why is it we have these mysteries on the Great Lakes? And why is this such an overlooked area? Join me as we explore these mysteries and try to unravel this vortex in the terrifying Great Lakes. The first question is the map anomaly. Why are the Great Lakes not actually on the maps that we have? When you look at the Great Lakes, if you're not familiar with the area, it's well known for being a very peaceful and serene area, especially the landscape around it. This is also stated to be the largest freshwater ecosystem in the land, and it's in the middle of North America. Although it should be noted that there are larger sources of fresh water in South America and in Asia from Russia at this day. But the Great Lakes has a special mystery and beauty behind it that many overlook because it does seem like it's a peaceful area. And the first anomaly being the maps. Ah yes, this lovely map where we have California depicted as an island. We do actually have a large body of water here in these rather strange mountains that look to be where Wisconsin and Iowa are today, running east to west. but perhaps the cartographers simply didn't know about the presence of the lakes. It is rather strange, though, since we understand the first explorations of North America to occur were done on boats, going down the waterways and looking for different points of interest. And it's rather odd that such large lakes, which the Great Lakes are indeed very large, would be missed by the early cartographers. But again, it was early exploration, and perhaps it just simply took them a little period of time to understand the land. That may not be as mysterious as it seems. But again, it's another oddity because we do have these early maps that were made by cartographers who needed to know exactly how to depict the various sea routes and the understanding of the land for proper navigation. And even on these later maps where we see we don't have the dramatic depiction of California as an island, we still don't have any Great Lakes. We do have Shilaga present, at least where we would expect Chicago to be, although some argue it's Montreal, and maybe it is. Who knows for sure? That's the whole point, though. It's rather odd that these maps would be so precise and yet omit a major detail as the Great Lakes. And we have Florida depicted in wonderful detail here, and we have these other strange cities or castles or whatever this is really supposed to claim, and other odd settlements that seem to be properly labeled. Now really go back in time and think about this as they were making these maps. How could there really be so many misconceptions, yet with exact coordinates, which you can really take from the lines of latitude and longitude on these early maps? It's always mystified me with the fact that we don't have the Great Lakes shown on so many of them. And indeed, it's not until you reach the maps of the 1700s and the 1800s when you start to see even the early depictions of the Great Lakes. Although, another oddity is that even some of the later maps omit them, when we'd expect them to be there. I mean, really think on this. This is the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, and yet it was omitted from these maps of exploration. We had these great Spanish and French explorers that were trumping all over the land of North America, and yet somehow they missed the Great Lakes, but they did manage to properly catalog certain mountain ranges, or mountain ranges that weren't there anymore. Again, it's just that odd fact with maps that we don't always know exactly what we're looking at, and we have so many variations. Norumbega. What exactly is Norumbega? So many different questions and so many considerations. And yet as time passed, you can see that eventually the Great Lakes did find their way onto the early maps. But it's rather strange that it seemed to be the St. Lawrence Seaway which was gradually widened, and then all of a sudden the lakes appeared in the later maps. Now, really consider that question. Was there actually a time when the Great Lakes were not present? Well, official history tells us that the Great Lakes were formed very recently, but certainly not within the last couple hundreds of years. And then we also see other variations of maps with California still depicted as an island or a separate landmass, but we do have some larger bodies of water. But again, you can see here that it seems to be incomplete and uncertain. So perhaps the explorers, the cartographers, they just simply didn't understand exactly where everything was. But again, the fact that this persisted for such a long period of time, when we had accurate navigation methods, it does seem to be the first prevalent mystery behind the Great Lakes. That real question of, were they always there? Were they always there even in more recent times than we'd like to believe? Because if these maps were accurate, and if they were properly surveyed, then we should see the Great Lakes on them, but we see absolutely nothing showing any sort of lake. And why is that the situation? Now, of course, as along with everything else, it seems as though the first proper maps that fully cataloged and surveyed the Great Lakes came from the 1800s or the late 1700s, depending on if you accept the original publication and composition time for these maps. And we finally start to get the sign that there are Great Lakes there, even with the proper names. It's such an anomaly because of the fact that if you think about how large these Great Lakes are, how could they have ever been missed? But of course, once the 1800s came along, the entire United States came into being, and it seems as though the Great Lakes came into being. Now, I'm speaking with dramatic flair in this particular situation, but it is very strange to me. And I think it's one of the most compelling mysteries that there was a time on many maps that there were no Great Lakes displayed at all. And again, it's only on the more recent maps. It is rather strange that we have so many events that allude to the 1800s. Officially, the Great Lakes were formed by the passage of glaciers, and we'll take a brief look at that from our scientific interpretations of it, and look at our official mainstream explanation for why the Great Lakes exist. I remember my first understanding of the Great Lake Superior having enough water in it to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. I don't know if that fact is true, but that's something that was relayed to me in one of my early classes. And here you can see the whole concept of how glaciers are stated to have passed over this landscape. And very recently, within the last 10 to 12,000 years, again, we always have these precise dates from the past, these glaciers passed over the landscape, left dead ice behind, and this is what is responsible for the very exact and precise formation of the Great Lakes, the glacial formation of the Great Lakes. I've always found it intriguing, though, that this did not happen in other portions of the land. This only happened very specifically in North America. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is impossible, merely pointing out the fact that this is a unique occurrence. All of these incredible lakes formed by this glacier all in this exact same period. And here we have the statement 12,500 years before present. Now, there's even claims that there were natives and inhabitants that witnessed this all happen right in front of their eyes. Although granted, it was on a very long timeline. Although with our normal chronology, we tend to see that natural formations such as this don't take place over a couple hundred or even a couple thousand years. It's usually something that takes place over millions of years. And so right here we already have a strange anomaly in addition to the map concept with the Great Lakes. They aren't on the earlier maps, and it seems as though even the scientific explanation says that they formed very recently. And when you go to the landscape and the area around the Great Lakes, you will find that there are many intriguing anomalies that even go past their legend of natural formation. And yes, I say legend of natural formation because there are claims there were inhabitants that actually witnessed this happen. But there's lots of remnants of very intriguing architecture and infrastructure that exist across the Great Lakes. Again, we could say it's easily explainable because there's many natural resources that flow out of the Great Lakes. There's also an incredible amount of shipwrecks all over. And there's many different explanations to explain the situation for why what we would expect to be peaceful inland lakes, even if they are large, have so many vicious weather situations within them. And why are all the Great Lakes known to be ship graveyards? It's another one of those puzzling mysteries that seems to be overlooked. Here you have it, the maps of the graveyard of the Great Lakes. In Lake Superior, all of these ships that have sunk or disappeared over time. Now, the prevailing explanation is that there is a unique weather condition that exists within the Great Lakes. And one of these weather conditions is called the Three Sisters in Lake Superior, a series of 3 rogue waves brought about by extreme weather conditions. Again, not exactly something that we'd be expecting. And perhaps one of the most famous shipwrecks on Lake Superior being the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which occurred very recently in the 1970s. And when you look at Lake Michigan, you'll see that it's no different. A vast array of shipwrecks and shipping losses over the years. I'm also impressed by the fact that we have a very precise and exact record, going all the way back to the 1600s, of every single large ship that was lost over time in these Great Lakes. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's impossible. It's just intriguing that we have these documents and these records so well kept. Because oftentimes when we have shipping losses, they tend to be obfuscated with legend and myth. Many times we'll have people that are skeptics or investigators who will tell us that shipping losses are merely the subject of myth and legend and that they didn't really happen. Or if we did in fact have all these major wrecks in 1600 here in Lake Huron, that they are very well documented and well known, and we know that every single one of these ships were lost due to unfortunate circumstances. But there's no mystery. There's never any mystery. Although when we look deeper into the legends and the myths behind the Great Lakes, we start to see that there are many more mysteries. We looked at their formation and the lack of the fact that they're on early maps. And now we have this strange weather phenomenon that occurs, not just in Lake Superior, but in all of the Great Lakes, with all of these shipping losses, and every single one of the Great Lakes being a true ship graveyard. Not exactly what we'd expect. And if you talk to mariners, they will tell you that, for the most part, sailing on the Great Lakes is rather easy, that there is no real weather difficulty to be expected. But then, contrary to their initial expectations, once bad weather comes up, it becomes some of the most difficult conditions many of them have seen. Now, what are really the differences between sailing on a freshwater lake and sailing in the open ocean? What are the different challenges? Many people will tell you, even beyond mariners, that they wouldn't expect the Great Lakes to be a difficult place to sail. We all understand that it makes sense for logistics to go outside the Great Lakes, and there's many products that are produced and shipped out on the St. Lawrence Seaway to the open ocean. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, as recently as 1975, and Gordon Lightfoot, of course, did the song on it. And there's mystery behind this, because the Edmund Fitzgerald was very well documented, quote unquote, and it was very well tracked as it went off on its path, and yet suddenly encountered very bad weather. Of course, this is one of the many hundreds of ships that we see that have been lost over time. Is there some sort of strange phenomenon that occurs on the Great Lakes? Some bizarre weather pattern that occurs that may be the result of some other forces even beyond weather? There's no doubt that there are rogue weather patterns that occur all over the land at strange times, but there do seem to be certain areas where these strange weather patterns occur with some sort of habitual recurrence. And why is this? Why is it that this legend of the three sisters, which apparently doesn't seem to be as much of a legend as we might think, exist on the Great Lakes? How is it that there are these weather phenomenon that can cause these very extensive shipping losses in these, what are supposed to be, easy to traverse inland seas? And these are freshwater seas. Granted that they're large enough and filled with a lot of water to be somewhat intimidating, because I still remember that factor, whether it's true or not, that there's enough water in Lake Superior to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. Who knows? Maybe there's a lot more water in it than we can imagine. But there are documentations and official accounts of horrific weather patterns that have affected shipping over the years on the Great Lakes, to say nothing for sailing there during the winter, because we are operating here at more northern latitudes. And I think that's one of the things that's always drawn me to the mystery of the Great Lakes that tends to be overlooked, because there are a lot of shipping losses. And by the way, there's not just shipping losses, there's also been numerous aviation incidences around the Great Lakes. And indeed, the area was featured in an In Search Of episode, The Mystery of the Great Lakes. And oddly enough, people tend to overlook it because they see the serenity and beauty of the Great Lakes, and also the fact that it is a major area for population. There are many cities on the Great Lakes, and they don't think of it as an area of mystery. But is it possible that there's something much more insidious going on here? That there could be some strange implications of bizarre electromagnetic phenomenon that are occurring on the Great Lakes? There's even the presence of the original Agonic Line that flowed through the middle of the Great Lakes. Now, you may recall the Agonic Line that we've explored in the past. It's constantly shifting over time, which is very odd in and of itself, because the existence of this line might be a reference to the changing of magnetic forces over time. And again, it could be another reference to strange phenomena that are occurring that we can't easily explain. And whether we're in the Great Lakes or in that little area of the Caribbean that we've talked about and explored in the past, could there be a connection? Could it even be possible that we're looking at some old effects from some technology of a previous civilization? Again, these will be dismissed by skeptics as simply being the wild imagination of people looking for explanations when there are none. That it's simply the reality of the Great Lakes that were very recently formed, weren't depicted on early maps, and seem to have been very recently discovered, that they just have these strange weather patterns that exist upon them. That it can be hazardous to sail a ship at any point in time through these strange weather patterns. Again, even though you're on an inland sea of fresh water, and you would expect the fact that you are completely surrounded by land to mitigate any weather patterns. And there's the aviation losses that have occurred over time. Many strange documented situations where entire planes have crashed or disappeared. And this is certainly not what we'd expect, because at the altitude that you fly, you're typically always going to see the land from any direction that you look. This isn't flying a plane over the ocean where it's ocean all the way out to the horizon. You're out in inland sea. You're in the middle of North America. Why would this be a difficult area where we have aviation losses? And yet again, we have numerous aviation losses. Very well documented aviation losses within our friends the media, talking about an airplane carrying 58 missing over Lake Michigan. And again, how large is Lake Michigan, especially from the air? Perhaps we could understand some ships being lost due to weather phenomenon, but what about these strange aviation losses that tend not to make a lot of sense? Why is it we have airplanes that have disappeared frequently over the Great Lakes? And we even have this memorial to Northwest Flight 2501, disappeared or went down June 23rd, 1950. Now, all these people who lost their lives, perhaps it is just an isolated aviation incident. And certainly accidents do occur, but why are there so many of them? And why is it the fact that this phenomenon seems to be confined to the Great Lakes and the area around the Great Lakes? There comes a point in time when you have a situation that recurs so many times that you have to start paying attention to it. There are rumors, legends, and myths of a triangle of doom or a zone of doom that exists over Lake Michigan, where there's been an extreme series of losses of both ships and planes over time. Now, you can certainly look at the records yourself and attempt to ascertain if there is something to this theory. Anytime we have an area of land or water that's designated, and typically whenever there's a triangle, well, then that's where we tend to have the issue of understanding why these phenomena exist. Because oftentimes skeptics will say, this doesn't exist, it's merely the product of imagination, or I'm going to sit out and I'm going to debunk this. Just because there's a lot of ships and a lot of planes that went down in this particular area doesn't necessarily mean there's anything strange going on. But this goes beyond just shipping and plane losses over time. We also have unexplained phenomenon, numerous UFOs, very strange weather patterns that have been seen in and around the Great Lakes over time. Now, what exactly are UFOs? Unidentified flying objects, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, as we seem to have renamed them here in the 2000s? But whatever you want to say, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are so many accounts of these strange events all centered around this area. Again, perhaps it is just an incredible coincidence. Maybe there's something within this fresh water that simply causes us to believe that there's weird events and we simply can't come up with an explanation. On the topic of strange events, let's explore the really unique architecture of the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. This is to commemorate the victory of Oliver Hazard Perry, a U.S. naval hero during the very interesting War of 1812, when he managed to build a fleet on Lake Erie and defeated the British fleet, which was also built on the other side of Lake Erie, in a decisive naval conflict in 1812. This monument was constructed, according to official sources, from 1912 to 1915. It happens to be the largest Doric column in the world. Of course it's the largest Doric column in the world. What else would it be? And constructed right before World War I, at least the United States entry into World War I. How fascinating. This was apparently a very decisive victory, this Battle of Lake Erie that Oliver Hazard Perry led. And for whatever reason, it stopped the attempted British control of the Great Lakes. I find it rather fascinating, though, that it wasn't really that decisive, because at the time the British had the greatest navy in the world, and they did actually land an expeditionary force that burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. But for whatever reason, securing the Great Lakes was decisive, winning the War of 1812. Also rather strange that the War of 1812 was named after a year and not something else. You know, the War of Preventing Sailor Impressment or something. I guess it just doesn't sound as cool. I mean, why hasn't there ever been another war that's been named after a year? Beyond that, we do have early construction photos of this impressive Doric column. And of course, we see the exact same construction techniques that we've seen in all the other construction photos that we have of virtually all the structures that were built from, 1860 to 1930, it seems like. Now, maybe it's possible. Maybe we did really build this structure. And maybe we had individuals such as this, people who worked 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and only had Sundays off when they would spend the entire day in church, who constructed these very, very impressive blocks that completed the Perry International Peace and Victory Monument. Yes, I'm mixing it up there. It's just intriguing to me that this monument is to commemorate Perry's victory over the British, but then it's also to celebrate the peace that's existed between the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. I guess that was still a big thing in the early 1900s, prior to the special relationship that was enjoyed by the United States and the United Kingdom, and of course the subsequent signing of the Atlantic Charter. Seriously, look into the Atlantic Charter, it's quite intriguing. But on the interior of this very impressive monument, once again we see interesting symbols, and we see construction techniques and detailing that we certainly don't see the construction photos really convincing us that this was all done. Now again, I'm not saying that we didn't actually have the evidence that our civilization built this impressive monument. It's just rather strange that some of the most dramatic and beautiful artistic impressions, especially on the interior, we never have construction photos that really detail how those were completed. Well, perhaps nobody wanted to photograph that. It would just simply be boring. We've got 3 very hardworking individuals in a photograph that were clearly shaping the blocks, and that should be good enough for us. And maybe we did indeed construct this. But once again, it's rather odd to think of the fact that we don't build monuments like this anymore. And keep in mind that this was also stated to have been done by a multi-state commission, because again, what else would it be whenever we're looking for an explanation on something like this? I've always found this strange, though, that the largest Doric column just happens to be off of Lake Erie. I mean, I know that, Perry's victory was an incredible moment for an American triumph, and the War of 1812 was the time when the United States really displayed that it was finally a power that was truly free of the control of Great Britain and subsequently the United Kingdom. At least that's what the official history says about it. Again, that very odd war that happened while the Napoleonic Wars were occurring, and for whatever reason was a very indecisive conflict. It also showed that there were limitations in terms of what could be done, but then for whatever reason, large expeditionary forces could be landed overseas and sustained over time. Very interesting icons and symbols, though, that continue to appear on this impressive monument, this monument for victory and international peace. Although, how exactly do you say it's international peace when you're all talking 3 nations? Don't ask me. It's very intriguing, though. Does it give us the impression that perhaps there is some other origin to this particular monument? Maybe these symbols mean something else and have an entirely different explanation behind them. Because I'm always amazed at the fact that we have these symbols that don't seem to match what we would think of as the traditional symbols of, well, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada at that particular time frame. I mean, you can see we've got the 3 modern national flags there hanging up, so I guess that's how we say it's the International Peace Monument, to say nothing of what was actually put on the walls in painstaking detail, and whatever the true materials of it were. And then in this nearby museum at this display, you'll see a more modern statue that depicts the great U.S. naval hero Oliver Hazard Perry himself. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. And yet, once again, you can see that, it's a statue, but you look at the very impressive, tallest Doric column in the world in the background. I mean, yes, it is. It does appear to be made out of blocks, so maybe we did it. But it's, again, just another oddity. Because whenever you look in the interior of these impressive monuments, you again see construction and detailing that seem to be beyond what would have been the expected capabilities at the time. Now again, the explanation is, well, they didn't have bureaucracy, they didn't have safety standards, and people work 6 days a week, or 7 days a week in many cases. They didn't need to eat, they didn't need to defecate, all they did was they worked. They worked, they worked, they worked. They never had any time or consideration for leisure, never mind the fact that we had amusement parks that were very well documented in that time as well, and that's how they were able to complete these very impressive constructions. And in the past, we just simply had more of a paramount importance that we devoted to our national monuments and our state monuments while we're at it, that we could adorn them to be so incredibly beautiful on the exterior, but then in the interior make them accessible to the individual. I always think about how the Sir Walter Scott Monument in Edinburgh in Scotland has an interior walkway and stairways in it, because I guess you need those things. And this is the view of the very surrounding and modest community that you can see from the Perry Monument. So once again, it's a series of questions that, again, don't have many good answers. I mean, you can look at those photos and you can accept the fact that, yes, those photos do very well document the construction of the Perry Monument. I mean, why we don't have a better chronology of photos that show it from start to finish, maybe there were just limitations. But again, going beyond this monument to other cities and communities, such as Duluth off of Lake Superior, there do seem to be many mysteries and anomalies. The rapid formation here of the canal zone in Duluth, Minnesota. This particular canal was stated to have been dug out by the good people of Duluth when they didn't want to lose their port and their shipping rights to nearby Superior in Wisconsin. So the people went out with their shovels and they dug out this entire canal zone. Yes, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And that's exactly what we're informed happened. Then, of course, the Army Corps of Engineers showed up because I guess the U.S. government had an interest in making sure that Duluth would be the major port and not Superior, Wisconsin, and that's how they completed this very impressive canal zone. Yes, the aerial lift bridge is quite an engineering wonder as well, and who knows what the real origin on it is. We're assured that we constructed it, and oddly enough, when you look at its origin, it actually wasn't an aerial lift bridge. It was a ferry bridge, and then they converted it into an aerial lift bridge. Very interesting from an engineering point of view. And Duluth has many unique architectural anomalies within it, from Central High School that we've looked at before. And you can look at the foundation of Duluth, another one of these interesting cities that grew up in a very short amount of time off the Great Lakes. And apparently Duluth was so successful that the people of Georgia decided to name one of their new communities after it. And this occurred in the 1870s, right after Georgia was still reeling from Sherman's march, but I guess they got over the Civil War pretty quickly. Whenever you look at these impressive monuments, whether you're in Cleveland or Detroit, you oftentimes see this. This isn't just the Perry Monument, but there's many others that commemorate the Civil War, the war between the states, or the War of the Great Rebellion, or all the other names that we seem to have for it from the 1800s. And you, again, see some very interesting construction materials that are used. You also see an interesting amalgamation of symbols that don't seem to conform or match. It's very intriguing when you think about how this all lines up with the fact that we do have some symbols that we might expect to see that do seem to represent what we think of as the United States at the time, but then we have conflicting symbols that don't seem to match exactly what we're seeing. They seem to represent something else. Now, is it possible that there was still a focus on these particular symbols at the time? I suppose so, but it's always interesting how the more defined depictions of the United States Civil War usually seem to be added on later, and then on the actual monument itself you see conflicting symbols that we'd not expect to see, such as the little wreath and the diamond in the background. What exactly is that supposed to be representing? The Great Union 12th Corps of Ohio? I'm not really sure. But you see this in all the Civil War monuments all across the land. And oddly enough, monuments in other lands where they didn't have a U.S. Civil War do seem to look rather the same. All of this in the Great Lakes area. All of these mysteries, this architecture, these disappearing ships, these strange weather phenomena, these magnetic forces, these sightings of strange aerial phenomenon, or unidentified flying objects, the loss of aviation over time, and other strange things that are observed in and around the Great Lakes. It tells us that there are many more mysteries behind the serenity and beauty. And now let us take a look underneath the surface of the Great Lakes. It's under the surface of the Great Lakes that we find even more strange structural phenomenon, ruins that appear to be sunken. Some people who say that these are the remnants of the Great Lakes' own monolith, if you will, or their own Stonehenge. Now, I haven't actually personally dived and explored these particular ruins, but the fact that they're at the bottom of the Great Lakes is yet another mystery. Is it possible that what we're looking at here is the remnant of some sort of great structure that may have once been part of an apparatus that was part of a greater technology, including magnetic forces over time? Could it have been that the civilization that came before us not only had the power to fashion the Great Lakes artificially, utilizing great means of technology, but they also had the power to change the very magnetic forces that are present in the Great Lakes? Is it possible that the agonic line is more than simply a line where magnetic north is 0 degrees and there's no declination, but it could actually be a line where realities meet, where we have multiple different physical realities, that there is still the possibility that they overlap because of the fact that this technology is still active in some way, shape, or form? There are many anomalous ruins both above and below the surface in the Great Lakes area. And if you get around to the Great Lakes, whether you're around Lake Superior or Lake Michigan, you'll find that beyond all of these particular ruins, there's no shortage of very impressive and anomalous structures, things that you wouldn't expect to see. Not only are we talking about the lighthouses, we're talking about early forts, early structures, and then of course there's all the impressive, unique, anomalous architecture in the great cities that we've explored, such as Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Duluth, and many others. And so it just continues to overlap all these mysteries that we have with this particular area. For example, this particular terrain feature, this rock formation. We're certainly to understand that this is a natural rock formation according to official sources, and yet when we look at it and study it, we can't help but wonder if there's a little bit more behind it. Is it possible that this could be the remnant of some artificial structure? Of course, we know that that's not to be the case if we accept the mainstream explanation behind things. But there's also the numerous reports of unidentified flying objects, or as we say now, unidentified aerial phenomenon, that are associated with the Great Lakes. Why is it that this is such a confluence of so many different mysteries? You realize that there is much more behind the wonders of the Great Lakes. There are also terrors to behold. Could it be that these are just simply visual anomalies? And when you explore the waters, you'll find no shortage of interesting little land masses such as this, that once again cause you to question if this is really just simply a natural formation. Could this be the remnants of some previous great artificial formation? And you'll find this all over the Great Lakes, whether you're on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, or Lake Erie. The very strange structures that are both above and below the surface. And going back to the strange weather phenomenon that occur in the Great Lakes. The strange weather phenomenon being used to explain all the shipping losses over the last hundreds of years that have been very well documented and are very well known. Waterspouts and tornadoes that occur, along with the very difficult weather conditions and extreme wind, to say nothing of the Three Sisters or the three rogue waves that'll appear in Lake Superior. Or do they appear in all the Great Lakes? And this is the reason why we have these extensive shipping losses. There's also the unique formation of rather impressive ice patches on the top of the Great Lakes. And you'll find that these ice patches are very aesthetically pleasing and yet oddly symmetrical. Now again, this is a natural phenomenon, but it is a very unique natural phenomenon, where you have formations of ice such as this. I suppose you could say it's much in the same way that a snowflake forms. And yet this is something that seems to be confined to the Great Lakes, where you have ice appearing on the surface in these very impressive natural and symmetrical patterns. Is it possible there may be another explanation behind this? Or, again, is it just simply a natural phenomenon that we just accept? So many intricacies and so many wonders to behold upon the Great Lakes. And whether you visit them in the summer or the winter, spring or the fall, there's always something unique about it. And if you're someone who's more used to swimming in places like the Caribbean, I strongly suggest you get used to immersing yourself in very cold water, as the Great Lakes will no doubt seem very cold to you, even if you go in August. The weather patterns have been well known over years, and yet we have the indication that perhaps the weather patterns are becoming more severe. Yet the official historical account also indicates that the weather patterns have always been severe along the Great Lakes. So is there a definitive reason for this, or is it just because of their unique location? Why is it that we have so many exceptions for the very existence of the Great Lakes. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there was actually a cyclone, a hurricane-like storm that did occur over Lake Huron in the mid-1990s. Certainly something that defies all of our expectations, because we'd expect a hurricane to happen somewhere in the ocean, the Caribbean, any one of the gulfs across the land, or the areas where we have hurricanes, but not over Lake Huron. But this really did happen. So is there another reason for this? There's also the rumors of the very unexpected vortexes that have occurred in Lake Ontario. Now, it's intriguing to think that the explanation for these vast shipping losses over the last several hundred years vary between the Great Lakes. Is it all because of odd weather patterns, or is there something else going on? Indeed, there are even rumors that at the bottom of Lake Ontario are some rather enigmatic structures. Again, these structures that may be reflecting the remnants of an apparatus of a previous civilization. Or again, it could just all be an incredible coincidence. But here you see this interesting shoal structure that looks rather artificial in my mind, but maybe it's just my imagination, and again, I haven't actually been down there. And that this is the explanation for the formation of this vortex. Does it have something to do with it on the bottom of Lake Ontario? Or again, is it all just part of that incredible massive coincidence? Looking at some of the land formations in the very coasts of the Great Lakes, you do also witness some rather dramatic changes between how the land alters from the lake to the actual height of it. Or, if you recall looking at the opening video of this particular exploration, you notice that there's some rather interesting rock formations, ridge lines, and a mixture of rubble along with overall great rock. Now again, it could be natural, but one can't simply dismiss the fact that there are many legends that indicate that there were great serpents that once existed in the Great Lakes. Is it possible that the Great Lakes were actually formed artificially in their entirety by this previous civilization? Now, I know this sounds like a very dramatic and far-fetched explanation or theory, but consider the possibility. Mainstream sources indicate that the Great Lakes formed relatively recently in the grand sequence of geological processes. There's also the understanding that if the Great Lakes were formed artificially by a previous civilization, perhaps they had some other reason for doing it. Did it provide this ecosystem that they were trying to nourish certain types of life? Or did they have some other aims entirely that go beyond our ability to explain? Or again, it could just simply be a massive coincidence. Perhaps if you go around Lake Superior on the north side, maybe you'll find a borad wandering around from Carful. And if anybody understands this reference, please let me know in the comments. But looking at the profile of the Great Lakes, we can see how the elevation changes and the depth of each of the lakes. It's intriguing to think of the fact that we haven't actually mapped or understand the bottom of all the lakes, and yet they are relatively deep. Certainly not anywhere as deep as the ocean, so we would expect to have a better understanding of each of the Great Lakes. It's also intriguing when you think of the changes in this elevation going from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes themselves, and how little of an understanding we actually have of what lies beneath the surface. Again, it could just all be a series of coincidences. All coincidences that all just happen to have a confluence in this particular area of land known as the Great Lakes. That these shipping losses were all just the result of bad weather, bad luck, or hard-charging captains, such as the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, who is stated to be one of those skippers who took his ship into all kinds of difficult weather conditions. Although one has to ask the question, how exactly does one go about avoiding difficult weather in the Great Lakes if they are beset by difficult weather all the time? When you look at a map such as this, it doesn't seem like the shipping losses are that extensive, but if you recall the earlier maps we look at, they are quite extensive, and they are very well documented in full detail all the way back to the 1600s. So taking it all together, what do we have with the Great Lakes, this land of wonder and this land of terror? Is it possible that there are anomalies and enigmas here that we will never fully explain or understand? Why is it that we had a certain researcher who just happened to be from Racine, Wisconsin, who decided not to even investigate any of these strange mysteries in the Great Lakes? As he was a research librarian, you would think that would have been one of his first considerations to debunk the great mysteries by his homeland. But he decided to focus on the Caribbean for reasons unknown. And that seems to be the situation, that many people do overlook what we have with these mysteries of the Great Lakes, even though this is right in the backyard of both Canada and the United States. There's also the presence of these many impressive lighthouses across all the Great Lakes, such as Split Rock Lighthouse here, vicinity 2 Harbors in Minnesota, north of Duluth. Here you have one of these very impressive lighthouses that was constructed, for what we understand, was the warning of navigation for ships on the Great Lakes to prevent shipping losses. And this was purported to have been constructed in the early 1900s, but you can see that there's some very impressive construction in this very isolated area. Indeed, Duluth and 2 Harbors are two very interesting communities to explore from an old world perspective. Now again, I will say it's possible we could have constructed this lighthouse in our current civilization, but you can go walk this site today and come to your own conclusions. I've been here, and I will admit that there are some rather unique anomalies with this particular site. Even the quarters for the lighthouse keepers are very well constructed brick establishments. Now, it is possible that they did it and they put all this effort into it, but it's very interesting when you step back and you explore this particular site in person, which I recommend if you have the ability to do that you do. You'll get the idea that it hints at something much more than just simply a lighthouse and some quarters that are located by it. Here we have our construction photo, and once again we have our iron frame construction that always seems to accompany anything with brick and masonry constructions from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Is that really what this is? Why do we have an individual that's just standing on top of that iron frame and not even balancing themselves? It's as though they don't care if they take the fatal plunge. And maybe they didn't. You know, they were working so hard all the time, 6 days a week with only Sunday off, with Sunday spent all day in church, and they walked uphill to school and work both ways. But if you can actually get on site to Split Rock Lighthouse, I advise paying close attention to the natural terrain, and also the break between what we understand to be the lighthouse foundation itself and the natural terrain. They seem to be very well blended together. And that's the mystery that we have, along with the fact that many of these lighthouses are stated to have haunted apparitions with them. Who knows exactly what's going on overall with the Great Lakes? There are so many different visual and physical anomalies to be encountered. Now, of course, you can just simply hand wave it all away and say that it's all a massive coincidence. It just happens to be the only largest freshwater ecosystem in the land that's in the middle of North America. And there's nothing else quite like it anywhere. There are so many different mysteries, so many wonders and terrors that we could explore in much great detail with all the Great Lakes and all the settlements and cities and accounts with them. We could dive underwater and spend endless amounts of time looking at the ruins and trying to find an exact explanation, some sort of understanding for why is it these lakes that, even according to mainstream science, have formed rather recently, have all of these mysteries associated with them. But as always, I leave it to you. It could well be that the mainstream explanation is correct. It could well be that this is just simply a confluence of many different anomalies. Shipping losses, strange weather phenomenon, the Agonic Line, these sightings of UFOs, all the product of imagination, all in one particular geographical area. Or it could be this really is an area that does have some tremendous significance to it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think there's anything unique, terrifying, or special with the Great Lakes? Well, thank you.
Sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Today we explore the Agonic Line terror emerging of realities. But in order to understand the Agonic Line, we have to examine accounts of lost ships and planes. And we begin by examining the account of Flight 19, a squadron of 5 torpedo dive bombers that disappeared in 1945 after World War II. This flight of 5 Avengers was under the command of Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, United States Navy Reserve. It's a well-known and well-studied mystery which has had many different perspectives on examining the account of what really happened. It should be noted that in this particular plane, it was 1 crew member short, although there are conflicting accounts that say that there was a substitute crew member to fill in as the radio operator of this plane. I'd also like to highlight that the other planes had pilots that were of the same rank of the flight commander, Captain George Stivers, who was in the United States Marine Corps, and then in this other plane of Flight 19, under the command of Captain Edward Powers. Both of them shared the same rank and pay grade as Charles Taylor. This situation was quite famous because 14 airmen were missing, conducting a training flight after World War II. It should be noted that Charles Taylor was actually a veteran of World War II, and had served on the USS Hancock, a Essex-class carrier towards the end of World War II. This was considered quite an unprecedented disappearance, though, because Charles Taylor was a combat veteran and had managed to find his way around the Pacific Ocean. We all understand, if you're familiar with the story of Flight 19, that this involved navigational errors, and specifically, Charles Taylor was the individual who was initially blamed for the fact that the flight became disoriented and was unable to find its way back to its home base or its original air station in Fort Lauderdale. Quite an intriguing account, though, when we look at the military record of Charles Taylor and the fact that he was someone who was actually elevated to the rank of flight instructor, and he had served as a naval aviator in the Pacific Ocean conflict. Our good friend, Skeptoid podcast host Brian Dunning, of course, condemns Charles Taylor and states that he's the one who made navigational errors. Brian Dunning bases his research on another researcher, an individual who we'll just call Lawrence because apparently I can't say his name, but I'll attach the link in the video description. And you can see that Lawrence did his own study 35 years after the fact. He even flew the route in completely different conditions and in a completely different plane. So therefore, I guess that's enough to say that he could officially debunk what happened to Flight 19. It's interesting to note, though, that they decide to condemn Charles Taylor as the individual who is responsible, and indeed, as the flight leader and commander, he is technically responsible for what happened. Although I find it fascinating that Charles Taylor did operate as a naval aviator in the Pacific conflict off the USS Hancock, an Essex-class carrier that saw a lot of action. Interestingly enough, it was the mother of Charles Taylor who decided to launch her own investigation after Flight 19 had vanished without a trace. Indeed, initially Taylor was found responsible when he reported that his compasses went out and that he was disoriented, believing he was over the Florida Keys, or south of Florida, and therefore tried to find his home station by flying on an azimuth that took him out in the middle of the ocean. That's what the official story said. To this day, though, there's never been any sign of wreckage of Flight 19 that's been found, and yet official sources tell us that the United States military had a very good idea and had actually triangulated the position of this flight shortly before it went down. Now, it should be noted that these torpedo dive bombers do sink rather fast when they ditch in the water. But it's rather strange when we consider the fact that this is right off the coast of Florida. There were several well-known radio triangulations that fixed the position of this flight, and that even though they were lost, the United States military had a very good idea of where they were, how much fuel they had left, and should have had a pretty good idea where they ditched. This diagram shows their originally plotted course on their training mission and a simple return to Florida. And it seems like it's simply a matter of 2 navigational turns to get back to Florida. Yet when this all transpired, the compasses went out, and for some reason Taylor was disoriented, and we don't really know what happened because we have transcripts of the radio transmissions. This apparently was the triangulation where they had located Flight 19, and they knew how much fuel they had left and had a pretty good idea of where they would have ditched. But as stated, no one's ever located any of the wreckage of these 5 planes when they ditched as they ran out of fuel. And it remains quite a mystery to this day in terms of what was really happening. Now you might be asking, what exactly does this have to do with the Agonic Line? Well, the Agonic Line, during this time frame, ran through this particular area. And indeed, it's been attributed to navigational issues. because on the agonic line, you do not have to compensate for the grid to magnetic angle, which you do when you are not on this particular line. You have to compensate for grid to magnetic. It is worth noting, though, that if these planes did ditch, they wouldn't have stayed on the surface very long and would have sank rather quickly, as there have been many demonstrations that show it. Although there would have been time for the pilots to get out of the planes if they were stuck in the middle of the ocean and rescue efforts couldn't have located them, then it's certain to say that they would have perished. But there's also the note that this Martin PBM Mariner disappeared while searching for Flight 19. The official account states that it likely exploded in midair. Although when I was looking at accounts of this particular type of plane, there's only one other example of this plane exploding in midair. No other examples. It's also worth noting that that same type of plane was the one that crashed in Operation High Jump under the command of Admiral Byrd. So what really happened to Flight 19? Well, officially, the flight was lost, and it should be noted that Charles Taylor was cleared by the United States Navy of any wrongdoing because his compasses malfunctioned. But why didn't either of the Marine officers take command if Charles Taylor was incompetent, or compromised, or lost? One would expect that would be the case. To this day, we don't know the fate. All we know is that we have individuals such as Brian Dunning, skeptoids who have confirmation biases, who simply want to state that they know exactly what happened, and other researchers. But that's one event. Let's move on to the same area with the loss of the USS Cyclops towards the end of World War I in 1918. This was a collier, or a ship that was designed to haul around coal, which was something they did in World War I in 1918. And this was another large news story of a ship, as opposed to planes that just randomly disappeared. And no, our friend Brian Dunning did not cover this particular disappearance, perhaps because it did not conform to some of his confirmation biases, or maybe he just didn't get around to it. In any event, in March 1918, while returning from a voyage to Brazil, the Cyclops and her crew disappeared. An entire crew of 300 sailors. Now, there was a war going on at that time, World War I, and there were German U-boats that were operating throughout the entire Atlantic. Yet it should also be noted that this ship was never confirmed lost or seized or destroyed by the Germans when German records were examined towards the end of World War I. So again, it's another disappearance. The commander of the ship, Commander Worley, actually was born in Germany with a German name, but he had been in the United States most of his life. Oddly enough, he had some strange psychological aberrations, so once again we have another account of a commanding officer who seems to have been compromised in some way. Yet, oddly enough, none of the other crew would have done something if their commanding officer was acting strange. Military discipline just always wears out. Nobody ever pulls a Commander Riker and relieves Captain Picard when he's about to take the ship into the sun. I mean, I know it's quite an analogy, but we have several examples of this happening. Worley was stated to have psychological aberrations, walking around in his underwear and a bowler hat at night, and often being a strict disciplinarian with his crew, going beyond the means of even normal naval discipline. But beyond all that, what exactly happened to the USS Cyclops? One might think that perhaps there was some sort of German conspiracy to actually seize the ship, but again, there's nothing in the German records. And indeed, at the end of World War I, the entire German high seas fleet was turned over to the Allies. So it seems rather strange. And even to this day, the Cyclops remains a mystery of sea. Now, there's theories that it was lost in a storm, that there was some issue with something that they loaded on the ship and it caused possibly an explosion. But again, not a single trace of the ship has been located, or the crew. No mutiny, no signs of anything else happening, nothing ever located on the bottom of the ocean. So, a strange series of conflicting accounts. And looking at the individual of Worley, who, oddly enough, there are accounts that his psychological aberrations seemed to get worse right before the ship disappeared. So again, it's another mystery, much like Flight 19. But also like Flight 19, this also occurs in a geographical area that does run along the agonic line. Again, this could simply be a coincidence. But what do you really think? Can we really add any text to this particular story? Or is it really just as it is, another ship that just happened to randomly disappear? Now, the main reason that we're exploring these accounts of disappearances is that you might think that these are isolated incidences. And indeed, if they were, then perhaps we could simply dismiss them as misfortune, or it really was due to the commanding officers in both cases being compromised. Although, again, we have to state that the whole reason that the rest of the crew, or the rest of the entire member of the military unit, did not decide to revolt or mutiny or impose order. It's just all very strange. It's very strange to think of the fact that an entire ship disappeared with a crew of 300, and this was towards the end of World War I. And there's nothing in the German records that indicate that this was due to enemy action of any way, shape, or form. And we look at this particular area, and we'll see later that this is the exact geographical area where in the past the Agonic Line ran through. So what exactly happened to the Cyclops? All we really have is speculation. And of course, someone such as a Skeptoid podcast host will tell us that we shouldn't make any sort of skeptical, or we shouldn't make any sort of inquiries. And I always find it fascinating that a skeptic simply means that someone has difficulty believing something. So they come in to do research with a confirmation bias because they're trying to disprove something, rather than simply looking at the facts objectively. Indeed, Mr. Brian Dunning claims that Charles Taylor's bad luck and his poor pilot and navigation skills caught up to him. Perhaps much in the same way that Brian Dunning's poor luck caught up to him when he was trying to run a cookie stuffing scheme against eBay. But I'll put those links in the description and you can come to your own conclusions about him. It's quite a tragedy, though, to think of an entire ship and entire planes just disappearing without any trace. Was there something off with Worley? Did he actually give a command to the ship that put it in a dangerous situation and caused it to sink? And we still wonder exactly what happened to it? Was this somebody who was affected by other forces? And indeed, to go back to the statement of Flight 19, there were other planes that had difficulty with navigation. And now we go to the Great Lakes, in Lake Superior, where an ore vessel was lost, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. And this was not World War I or after World War II. This was late 1975 when this transpired. So we're talking about more modern equipment, more modern technology, and even more strange, in Lake Superior, a freshwater lake that's surrounded by land, certainly not the open ocean. And yet you might be surprised to know that Lake Superior, and especially the area where the ship was lost off of Whitefish Point, is a well-known area where many ships have been lost. It's considered a graveyard of Great Lakes shipping. But how exactly could something like this transpire? This area in Whitefish Point is very close to land, and one would not expect that Lake Superior would be that difficult of an area to navigate. And yet there are many different examples of ships, such as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, that came across difficult conditions and suddenly sank. Now you're probably asking, well, wait a minute, again, what does this have to do with the Agonic Line? Because I thought the Agonic Line was east of Florida. Well, actually, would you be surprised to know that the Agonic Line has moved over time? And the Agonic Line was in this particular area of the United States in the Great Lakes. There's always interesting shipping that was always used, and these were purpose-built ships to get across the Great Lakes. And yet there were so many losses because of the unique conditions on Lake Superior. So many ships that went to the bottom near Whitefish Point and in other areas, and not just Lake Superior, but also Lake Michigan. It's rather strange. There's also accounts of planes that have vanished without a trace, and this seems really strange because wherever you're flying at particular altitudes, you can see the land off either wing. We also examined the account of what happened to the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, and it should be noted that unlike the other two examples, we do know where the wreckage is, at the bottom of Lake Superior, and we have a relatively good idea of what happened. It seems to be extreme weather tore the ship apart and it abruptly sank. It was traveling in tandem or close to another ship during these difficult stormy conditions on the Great Lakes. There's also the legend of the Three Sisters, or the three waves that suddenly come up, rogue waves that rapidly smash into ships that are traversing the Great Lakes, especially this area in Lake Superior, and brings them under very difficult and overwhelms their structural capacity. There's also the reputation of the captain of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, who was considered a hard-driving skipper, or someone who would take his ship through very difficult weather conditions instead of going off to wait them out in a safe bay. So a very interesting series of accounts. But once again, we have to recall that this was not an isolated incident, especially with this series of shipping accidents that occurred on Lake Superior. And we can find in other images that it does seem that during particular times of the year, navigation and traversing the Great Lakes might be a matter of a little bit more difficulty than one would initially think. Indeed, the graveyard of the Great Lakes accompanies the myth of the Three Sisters. And it should also be noted that there's a lot of Native American myths about particular creatures and strange weather phenomena that may be operating in and around the Great Lakes. Is there something from these forces that still persist to this day? Or is this just simply a matter of this being a unique area where there are unique weather phenomena that caused all of these ships that you see pictured here to sink, and the particular time and date that they sank within the Great Lakes? It gives the impression that even the purpose-built ships had struggles and faced many great losses. And we're not talking about the open ocean here. We're again talking about the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada, an enclosed space where one would think that navigation would be easy. And indeed, when you look closer at all the shipping that's been lost in Lake Superior alone, it does give the impression that this is a much more challenging area to operate in than one would originally believe. But what does this all state about this agonic line that we're looking at? Is this because there are some sort of unique conditions? And we stated earlier that trying to understand what conditions these ships, these planes faced during this particular time is not necessarily something that we could replicate even if we traverse the same area at a later point in time. It seems as though the conditions change based on some factors that we're not necessarily familiar with. Because many other days you could sail quite easily across the Great Lakes. You won't encounter bad weather. It'll be quite an easy place and an easy journey to undertake. But I would certainly not recommend that you go swimming in Lake Superior in August, especially if you're someone from Florida. But the Great Lakes are an anomaly in and of themselves. How exactly were they formed? Why are they so specific in their geographical location? And even more strangely, why is it we have older maps that don't show the Great Lakes? Perhaps the cartographers simply weren't aware of them, but oddly enough, when we're informed that exploration was based on following waterways, we would expect that the Great Lakes would be one of the first things that the explorers would be aware of. Regardless, we do have other diagrams that give us an idea of how these Great Lakes freighters could break apart and some of the phenomenon that would be responsible. Now, of course, this would be natural phenomenon, and the layout of Lake Superior seems like it would support the destruction of these ships. But again, it's a large scale of losses, and oftentimes there are other ships and other planes that have disappeared without a trace. And so what exactly is really going on with this particular area? We also look at some of the very unique original purpose-built ships, the whalebacks that operated on the Great Lakes. Quite an intriguing design, and yet there's no shortage of this purpose-built design also having struggles. And so we look at this in totality, ships and planes in particular areas that just disappeared. What exactly is the agonic line? Well, when we look at the concept of navigation, we start by examining the pole. And with navigation, we have three poles. We have the North Magnetic Pole, we have the actual geographic North Pole, and then we have the North Geomagnetic Pole. Yes, 3 poles for navigation. What exactly is the commonality? Well, there's 3 types of direction. You have true north, a line from any point on the Earth's surface to the North Pole. You have magnetic north, the direction to North Magnetic Pole, indicated by a north-seeking needle of a magnetic compass. And then you have grid north, vertical grid lines on a map, utilized by the United States military and other militaries for rescue teams and the accuracy. When you are not on the agonic line, you have to convert your grid north to your magnetic north. And on every military flat map, yes, they have flat maps in the military, they tell you exactly how to convert a magnetic to a grid azimuth. So you can make sure that when you've plotted a course or an azimuth, and you're using a compass to follow it, you're actually following the compass. Now what's strange about the agonic line is you don't have to make this adjustment. You don't have to adjust for grid to magnetic north, because you're on the agonic line. So when you plot your course on your grid map, you just simply shoot your compass. And yet other individuals have stated that because navigators, whether they were naval aviators or pilots of ships, they didn't actually have to make this adjustment. And yet they did, and this is why they had vast navigational errors. This is one of the official explanations for why these particular areas that we've looked at, and yes, they have other names to them with geographical names, but individuals like Brian Dunning claim to have debunked them, or rather they've reference the researchers of others, such as Brian referencing the research of the individual named Lawrence, who investigated Flight 19 35 years after the fact, and after the family of Charles Taylor had passed away and claimed to have come to a conclusion. But back to understanding the agonic line, you might be surprised to know that there's a lot of drift in what magnetic north actually is. So the point that we actually have with magnetic north changes over time, and therefore where your needle on your magnetic compass is pointing changes. Apparently this has been well known, and this is documented on earlier maps used for navigation. Of course, these were earlier maps that, again, didn't show the Great Lakes in North America and depicted Antarctica as a vast landmass called Terra Australis. Quite intriguing, but they seem to be aware of this phenomenon, this variance. There's also the fact as to where the agonic line currently runs. And remember that it was originally further east, and we'll take a look at some historical examples of where the agonic line was. Remember that the agonic line is where you do not have to adjust from grid to magnetic north and vice versa. Yet if you look at other examples of these lines and these agonic lines and where they run and where they've operated, you can see that there's vast differences for what sort of adjustment you need to make. So if you're a mariner and you're sailing the oceans of the lands, you need to make sure that you make this proper adjustment if you're relying on a magnetic compass. Very strange that the agonic line also happens to run right over the area of Dubuque, a city which is near the border of, which is in Iowa on the Mississippi, near the boundary of Wisconsin and Illinois. That's come up in our explorations quite a lot. What exactly is the significance of the agonic line? And why does it always seem to be running in areas where there's strange events that occur, or many disappearances, or natural disasters? Whatever the real reason for the disappearance or losses of these ships, we can see that at some point in the time in the past, the agonic line has run through these particular areas, whether it was in Lake Superior or in the Atlantic off of Florida. It's rather strange, too, that we have other maps that show the agonic line being further east. And again, that drift is attributed to the change in the magnetic field of the planet. At least, that's what the mainstream will inform us, although who knows exactly how they came to these conclusions. One of the interesting things to me here is now in this older map we have the agonic line running directly over Chicago and Peshtigo, Wisconsin, two areas that we've explored. And here in this older map we can see where the agonic line was plotted in the past, in 1803, 1850, 1875, and 1890. And here's where you can see that the agonic line did exist in the geographical areas where these other strange disappearances occurred. And of course, like I said, there is that name for the, how shall we say, pseudoscience geographical area of Florida, off of Florida, but we're not going to mention that name because we're focused on the agonic line today. It's very interesting to me that other explorers very rarely look into the concept of the agonic line. And yet the fact is that we're reliant on Earth's magnetism to ascertain exactly where the line is going to be. And it also plays a role in how we have to adjust our map to compass readings based on where we're positioned. Yet, oddly enough, how exactly do we know about this south magnetic pole, this north magnetic pole, and the generation of this magnetic field? It seems to be something that we've studied, and yet we don't fully understand. It's something that we claim to understand. But what's really going on with these magnetic poles? Is there some other force that's being generated here? Is there some other explanation for what's truly happening? Because why do we really have this drift in magnetic pole? The explanation will be it's because our magnetic field changes. And you might recall that the only film that ever decided to try to explore the concept, a rather forgotten film from 2003 called The Core, which involves a group of explorers going to the very core of the Earth to restart it, because scientific meddling prior had caused the core to stop generating the magnetic field, and soon the Earth was going to be burned by the sun. And naturally the solution was to involve building a burrowing ship made of a material called unobtainium, yes, that term gets used a lot, to go to the center of the Earth. And they had to restart the core. And you never guess how they'd have to do it, by detonating a couple nuclear weapons. Ah yes, how many times is the plot of a film solved by detonating a couple nuclear weapons? Especially during this time frame. Well, the film had some interesting premises behind it, although it is considered fantasy because no one's really ever gotten that far into the Earth's crust, and even the deepest borehole doesn't even come close to actually reaching through the crust. These are the voyages of Captain Greenwood and First Officer Swank as they explore beneath the surfaces. But the odd thing about this film, though, is we really have to consider what understanding do we have of the magnetic field? Because this is really more of a fantasy film. They wouldn't consider this science fiction. And why is it that this variance in the Earth's magnetic field causes the agonic line to shift? And what's really happening along the agonic line? Is this a natural phenomenon? Or is this some sort of remnant of a previous civilization? Is this some sort of technology that they had attempted to apply, and this is what caused all these changes? This is why we have these variances in where the agonic line is, depending on time. And therefore, if the agonic line is moving, which we're informed that it is, because magnetic north changes as time passes, then how could anyone have replicated the conditions when they try to determine what happened to these lost planes and these lost ships? Indeed, imagine if this was some sort of remaining technology. What was it really all about? Did the previous civilization rely not only on cymatics, not only on frequency, but also on some sort of force and understanding of magnetism? What if what we think of as the planet's magnetic field is actually generated by remaining technology that's still from the previous civilization that we do not completely understand? And if that is the case, then what remnants of this technology are to be found out on the land? Has someone already located them, and do they have an understanding of what this technology is? I find it awfully strange that the United States military, during a time after World War II, decided to clear Charles Taylor, absolve him of all wrongdoing, even though they had the very clear individual who was responsible for Flight 19 being lost. And yet, at the behest of his family, they just decided to say he wasn't responsible. It almost seemed as though the family was asking questions that somebody didn't want it asked, and they decided to basically say, well, he wasn't really responsible. His compasses failed, and that's why the flight was lost. Now don't ask any more questions about it. And then about 3 decades later, our special researcher Lawrence decided to debunk it. And then it was reinforced by our good friend Brian Dunning. But what are your thoughts? Is the agonic line some sort of blending of realities? Is it some sort of remaining technology? Or is it all just a massive coincidence? Is it all just the fact that these ships and these planes disappear in these areas because disaster strikes and it just happens to strike in the same place? Does luck actually play a factor? I'm surprised Brian Dunning doesn't ask for that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. And I decided to share the strange tales with all of you. I'll be going back though and spelling out what my thoughts are on each of these particular tales and how they fit into the old world of the Prime Explorers. But I thought they were important enough to convey to everybody. There's a little note though. Of these stories, 19 are based on easily found facts, but the others tell about ghosts. Ghosts and reports of ghosts are not easy to check. Without objective clues, ghost hunters must depend on the word of the viewer. Did he or she really see something? Who can say? What we can say is this. In each of the ghost stories that we're going to be looking at, a person thought they saw something very strange, and each of the viewers was convinced that what they saw was an actual ghost. These people honestly felt they were reporting what was true. That is why these ghost stories have been included in this book called Strange But True. But remember, as you read them, we only have the word of the viewer. What a wonderful objective note. It might not surprise you to find out that we are reading or recounting tales from a book from the 1980s. And yet, oddly enough, all of these accounts at the time were taken as historically accurate. And yet since then, the so-called skeptoids, our favorite people such as Brian Dunning and others, Larry Kush, seem to have come out of nowhere and have gone back and have caused us to question these accounts. Well, as always, I remind you to remain objective, and I hope you enjoy this. First story, he carried a curse. His first name was Robert, and he might have been president of the United States had he chosen to run for the office. Instead, he served his country ably in subordinate roles, as Secretary of War under 2 presidents, and as Minister to Great Britain under a 3rd. In private life, he was a successful lawyer and became head of the Pullman Company. Yet he came to believe that he carried a special curse. As a youthful captain in the Army, He stood beside the bed of President Lincoln only hours after Lincoln had been shot. The president died. As Secretary of War, he hurried to the railroad station in Washington, D.C. to tell President Garfield he could not accompany him to Elberon, New Jersey. He arrived to find the president had just been shot. The president died. As a leading businessman, he was invited by President McKinley to meet him at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. When he arrived, he learned that the president had just been shot. The president died. From that day forward, Robert never allowed himself near a president. He declined all invitations to the White House. "If they only knew," he remarked in private, "they wouldn't want me." Once upon being asked if he would be at an event where a president was to appear, he reportedly said, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not invite me. There's a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." The man who believed that somehow he had been the instrument of death to 3 martyred presidents was laid to rest forever in 1926, 61 years after the assassination of his father, Abraham Lincoln. The Floating Coffin. On the morning of August 12, 1775, the Greenland whale ship Herald was picking her way among the icebergs of the North Atlantic. Suddenly the lookout bellowed, "A ship! A ship! West ahead!" On deck, the Herald's captain turned in surprise. Some 3 miles away, he saw masts poking above an iceberg. Slowly, a 3-masted schooner drifted into view. Her sails hung in tatters. Ice coated her spars and rigging. She glistened in the sun. Captain Warren studied her through his telescope. He saw no signs of life. Veering close, he hailed the strange ship. Silence greeted his shouts. The schooner continued on her seemingly aimless way. "Lower the longboat," Captain Warren ordered. "I'm going to have a look." His crew were superstitious and had no mind to venture aboard a ghostly ship. Nevertheless, they obeyed. Captain Warren picked 8 men and rowed over. As the longboat neared the schooner's stern, the men made out her name. Octavius. She was unknown to them. Again, Captain Warren hailed her. Only rotting timbers and the wind in the loose rigging answered him, crackling and whispering. With 4 of his crew, the captain climbed aboard. The deck was slippery with ice-encrusted snow. Seeing no one topside, the boarding party went below. In the crew's quarters, they found 28 men, frozen to death. Each lay in his bunk, heavily bundled in blankets and clothing. The fierce Arctic cold had perfectly preserved their bodies. Next, the investigating crew entered the cabin of the captain, whose body was seated in a chair by a work table. In a cabin behind this one were 3 more corpses. A woman lay in one bunk, her head resting lifelike on her elbow. The body of a man sat cross-legged on the floor in one corner. His hands held a flint and a piece of steel. Before him was a pile of wood shavings. Death had overtaken him as he had struggled to light a fire. Alongside the man was a sailor's jacket. Captain Warren lifted it. Beneath was the body of a small boy. The men of the Herald had seen enough. They wanted to get off at once. But the captain wanted to investigate further. He managed to inspect the galley, but he found no food there. But then his men were on the verge of panic and threatening mutiny. Taking the schooner's logbook, Captain Warren reluctantly returned to his ship. He watched the Octavius and her cargo of death drift northward out of sight. She would never be seen again. Later, when he retired to his cabin to read the logbook, the captain discovered that all but the first and last pages were missing. The sailor to whom he had entrusted the book had allowed the rest to fall out. The first page included the information that Octavius had departed England, bound for the China trade, on September 10, 1761, 14 years earlier. The last page had but a single entry. It was dated November 11, 1762, and read, "We have now been enclosed in ice 17 days. Our approximate position is longitude 160 degrees west, latitude 75 degrees north. The fire went out yesterday, and our master has been trying to rekindle it, but without success. He has handed the steel and flint to the mate. The master's son died this morning, and his wife says she no longer feels the terrible cold. The rest of us have no relief from the agony." Captain Warren's eyes returned to the words. Longitude 160 degrees west, latitude 75 degrees north. The meaning was incredible. On the day of the last entry in the logbook, Octavius had been icebound in the Arctic Ocean, north of Point Barrow, Alaska. thousands of miles from where Captain Warren had just boarded her. A continent of ice lay between these 2 points. What Octavius had negotiated was the legendary Northwest Passage. For hundreds of years, sea captains had sought a shorter route between the Atlantic and the Pacific to carry trade between Europe and the Far East. The Northwest Passage was a dream that could eliminate the long voyage around the tip of South America. Apparently, the captain of the Octavius also had decided to try to find the Northwest Passage. Instead of sailing home to England around South America, he had tried, and like so many before, he had found death instead. But the Octavius had succeeded on her own. Year after year she sailed on, her ship's wheel unattended. She inched eastward through the vast fields of ice, blindly withstanding the fury of the elements, till she finally floated again in the North Atlantic. Not until 1906, 130 years later, did another ship, Gajoa, commanded by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, navigate the Northwest Passage. But Octavius had been first, carrying a captain and a crew who had been frozen for 13 years. The Night Thing. What was it that walked through stone walls, jumped over 18-foot haystacks, and stepped across a river 2 miles wide? Beast, bird, or the devil? To this day, no one knows. But something did what couldn't be done. And it left its footprints in the towns and villages of Devonshire, in southern England a century ago. On the night of Thursday, February 8, 1885, snow began to fall over Devonshire, a little before 8 o'clock. It fell in uninterrupted silence until nearly midnight. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Henry Filk, a banker, stopped from his house. He paused briefly to admire the blanket of snow. Then he noticed a train of footprints across his enclosed yard. Each print was U-shaped, as if made by the shoe of a pony or donkey. Henry frowned. The footprints, or hoofprints, were all in a line, one in front of the other. No man or animal walked like that, as if on a tightrope. Henry was not a curious fellow. He shrugged, went into his bakehouse, and started his day's labor. An hour later, the whole town was abuzz. Others had discovered the hoofprints. Eagerly, they sought to catch a glimpse of the creature responsible. At the start, it was all great fun, but the longer the trackers followed the single line of prints, the stronger grew their sense of uneasiness. Whatever had visited them during the night possessed extraordinary powers. In places, the hoofprints had led right up to the garden walls of stone as high as 12 feet. The prints stopped at the base and resumed on the other side as though no wall stood in the way. Could the creature have jumped over? Hardly. The depth of the prints in the snow never changed. Neither did their size, which measured 4 inches by 2.5 inches, and without exception they were spaced 8 inches apart. Moreover, the trail never doubled back, though it led up to every house in town. Why? Was the creature marking the occupants? While the people of Topsham puzzled nervously, the mystery spread and deepened. As far south as Totanis, the same single trail had been seen in dozens of places. The distance between the two towns is about 96 miles on a straight line. The snowstorm had ended at midnight. 6 hours later, Henry discovered the tracks. In 6 hours, what could have moved fast enough on a wandering zigzag course to reach points 96 miles apart? Nothing known in that day or unearthed in this. Prints were found in cemeteries, atop wagons, on beaches and roofs, in woods and marketplaces, and up to and beyond 18-foot high haystacks. Prints were tracked to the edge of the Exe River, where it was 2 miles wide, and picked up again on the opposite bank. A similar crossing was found a few miles to the south. Everywhere the horseshoe prints were the same, 4 inches by 2.5 inches at intervals of 8 inches. Nowhere in the snow was there a sign that the creature had rested. Fun and curiosity gave way to uneasiness. Presently, superstition and fear took command. As the snow melted, the tracks blurred. The prints began to resemble a cloven hoof. Who but the devil had a cloven hoof? Who but the devil would peer into the dwellings of God-fearing folk and mark the sinners? Women and children hid in their homes behind barred doors and shutters. The men fetched their dogs. Armed with muskets, pistols, clubs, and pitchforks, they grimly tramped the countryside. Apparently nobody paused to consider how to capture the devil once he was cornered. That difficulty never arose. The night prowler, beast, phantom, or devil passed unseen. Plenty of snow fell in the days that followed, but the tracks never reappeared. For weeks afterward, men went about carrying weapons and lonely trails were avoided. Clergymen preached about the signs in our midst as warnings from heaven about drinking, swearing, and loose living. The London Times and other newspapers carried many columns about the strange hoofprints. Expert opinion abunded like wildberries. The prints, it was claimed, were made by giant leaping rats, huge rabbits, birds, otters, toads, kangaroos. Richard Owen, a respected naturalist, blamed the badger without ever having seen the prints. None of the explanations fitted the facts. Thousands of hoof prints in a single line, exactly 4 inches by 2.5 inches, exactly 8 inches apart. Roaming tirelessly, in absolute silence at uncanny speed, over and through every obstacle. The men and women who struggle with the mystery are gone, but the questions linger. Where had the night thing come from? Where was it going? And when would it walk again? The clue in the sand. One of the strangest of all detective cases took place on a beach in France in 1888. It began the day as a businessman named André Monet and his wife arrived at the small French seaside town of Saint-Andrés for a vacation. Late that night, Monet left his hotel to take a swim before going to bed. He never returned. Early the next morning, a boy discovered him laying on the beach, dead of a bullet wound. The French National Police sent Detective Robert Ledru to investigate. Oddly, Ledru happened to be in Le Havre, which was within walking distance of Saint-Adresse. Ledru was selected to go to the scene of the crime because of his reputation, not because he chanced to be nearby. He was considered brilliant. Not only was he the youngest detective on the police force, he was easily the most successful at solving mysteries. It was claimed that he could sniff a used but empty glass and identify the drink, and could look at a footprint and describe the person who made it. His superiors believed him a wizard at swiftly finding and reading clues. The truth was something else. Robert Ledru was neither swift nor brilliant. He was patient and thorough. Far from solving mysteries at a glance, he worked slowly and carefully. He spent hours and even days at the scene of a crime, going over every foot of ground. He scarcely slept until he had checked out every clue, every alibi, every suspect. By dogged determination, he had built a dazzling record. That record was his lifeblood, and he did everything to further it. For example, he never admitted that he had toiled around the clock, tracing the owner of a button. In his report, he wrote only that he had deduced who the owner was. To his superiors, he seemed the ideal man to send to the beach at Saint-Adresse. And he was. No one but Robert Ledru could have solved the murder of André Monet. But when the great detective arrived, he could uncover no leads. The murdered man had no known enemies. He had not been robbed. His only heir was his wife, and she had waited up for him in the hotel lobby in view of the night clerk until 2:30 a.m. Since the coroner had fixed the time of death at no later than 2 a.m., she was cleared. Ledru was making no progress. Worse, the many nights during which he had passed up sleep in order to work on his case were catching up with him. He was exhausted, and his nerves were strung taut. Oh, how he longed for time to rest. How he would sleep, peaceful sleep. He had told no one about his nightmares. But before he could rest, however, there was this new murder to solve. Night fell, and still his efforts led him no closer to the killer. He resorted to his tried and tested tools, patience and painstaking thoroughness. He marked a large circle around the spot where the body had lain. Lantern in hand, he examined every inch of sand, in and near the circle. Near midnight, he found the clue, a footprint. It told him the identity of the murderer, and it shook him to the bone, for the footprint was what he had been half-consciously looking for all along, and dreaded. The guilty man was someone he had known all his life. The struggle within Ledru was soul-wrenching. Should he turn the murderer in? Duty at last overcame every personal objection. After walking the beach for hours, Robert Ledru entered the police station. He had solved the case, he announced, and laid upon the desk a plaster cast of a footprint. It was of the left foot. The footprint unquestionably belonged to the murderer, the detective asserted. He had sneaked up behind his victim in stocking feet. As proof, Ledru pointed to the plaster cast. The first joint of the big toe is missing. Then he stopped and took off his own shoe. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I am the murderer." He had lost the first joint of the big toe on his left foot while a boy. The nightmares in which he saw himself commit murder had come true. Ledru was placed under arrest and eventually brought to trial. Respected doctors testified in his defense. Due to a rare mental condition, they stated, Robert Ledru was dangerous only at night. During the day, he was perfectly sane. The words of the doctors, plus a masterly pleas by his lawyer, saved Ledru from execution. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was carried out only in the hours between sunset and sunrise. During the daylight, he was set free to go wherever he chose. Robert Ledru died in his cell in 1939. For 51 years, he served his unique sentence, walking the streets during the day and returning at night to be locked up. The Elevator Operator. Frederick Blackwood, the famous British diplomat known as Lord Dufferin, once saved his life because he recognized a ghost. His encounter with the supernatural began while he was staying overnight at a friend's house in Ireland. He couldn't fall asleep, and all at once he was aware of something eerie, something he could not explain. With senses sharply alert, he got out of bed and went to the window. Moonlight of unusual brightness flooded the grounds. He heard moaning. He listened, tensing. There it came again. "I must get a hold of myself," he thought. His mind shook off the stories he'd heard of haunted old Irish houses. It is the breeze stirring in the trees. The moaning grew steadily louder and closer as Lord Dufferin squinted into the deep shadows cast by the huge ancient trees. He saw something move. Then he heard panting. A man staggered from the shadows into the bright moonlight. He carried a long black box on his back, and he was moaning and panting under its weight. Lord Dufferin left his room and hurried out onto the lawn. In the full moonlight, he saw the black box was a coffin. "Here," he called. "What are you doing with that?" The man lifted his head from under his burden. Lord Dufferin saw his face and recoiled a step. It was a face so ugly and evil that he would never forget it. Was the man a grave robber? Lord Dufferin nerved himself. "What are you doing with that?" he called again. As he approached within a few strides, the man in the coffin disappeared before his eyes. Shaken, Lord Dufferin searched for signs of footprints in the dewy moonlit grass. There were none. Returning to his room, he wrote of the details of the bewildering experience in his diary. When he laid down his pen, he believed he had written an end to the matter, even if he would never forget that face. But ended the matter was not. Years passed, during which Lord Dufferin served England as ambassador to Italy and to Russia, and as Governor-General of Canada. Then in 1891 he was named ambassador to France, and in the city of Paris he met the ghost again. The place was the Grand Hotel. Lord Dufferin stood waiting for an elevator to take him to a reception. The other men in the lobby moved aside respectfully to let him enter first. The door opened. Lord Dufferin started forward, then froze as he saw the elevator operator. How could he forget that ugly, evil face? The operator was the same man he had seen carrying a coffin years before in Ireland, the man who had vanished into thin air. Calling upon all his self-control, Lord Dufferin betrayed no outward sign of terror. To the others waiting, Lord Dufferin mumbled an excuse and bid them go aboard. As they crowded into the elevator, he rushed to the hotel office. He must know who the man was. The crash sounded as he reached the office door. A cable had broken. The elevator had plunged 5 floors, killing everyone inside of it. At the insistence of Lord Dufferin, the secret services of England and France sought to learn the identity of the mysterious elevator operator. Who was he? Where had he come from? No one ever found out. Potemkin's Villages. The movies have never known a producer to equal the talents of Gregory Potemkin. Yet he did not make one picture. He made a country. He built pretty villages with little more than cardboard and paint. He peopled them with dancing peasants who were hurried from place to place, a step ahead of their unsuspecting audience. He did it all to make the woman he loved happy. She was Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, and they may have been secretly married, no one knows for sure. In 1783, Catherine had acquired the Crimea. She appointed Potemkin governor of the area. His job was to turn the barren land into a thriving country. Potemkin went to work with a will and a vast imagination. He promised Catherine hundreds of improvements, and in the next 3 years made several trips north to the capital to report his successes. Catherine was thrilled with his words. She must see for herself. Potemkin had not made a wasteland bloom. He had, however, created the appearance of lush countryside for Catherine's pleasure. When Catherine expressed a desire to see it, he hastened ahead to make final arrangements. Catherine set out on her tour of the Crimea in a sleigh, a heavy sleigh-like horse-drawn platform. It was the size of a small house, and the Empress took 40,000 followers with her. At every station along the route, 500 fresh horses were waiting, and at every station Catherine stared in delight. Houses had been repainted on the side facing her, and roofs repaired with cardboard. Young girls strewed flowers in her path. Old and sickly people had been locked indoors. Artificial trees blocked unsightly areas. Begging was forbidden. Everyone Potemkin had ordered must express happiness by smiles and gestures. Years before, Catherine had traveled the same road. She had seen the misery in the angry faces. She was overcome by the change. "Is not my little household prettily furnished?" she gasped to the French ambassador. All this was but a taste of what was to come. The real journey through Potemkin's fairyland began at the Dnieper River. 7 floating palaces, trailed by 80 smaller vessels, carried 3,000 persons past never-ending wonders. While Catherine and a royal party lay under silken awnings and dined on plates of gold, a storybook landscape streamed by, villages decorated with triumphal arches, cattle grazing contentedly, carefree peasants dancing at dusk. Catherine could not guess the truth, that the wonderland vanished behind her. The triumphal arches were shakily thrown up. Farmhouses were without real roofs, windows, or doors. The villages were deserted. The cattle had been brought great distances without feed to make them graze contentedly. The carefree dancers were poor peasants, taught their steps by threats and beatings. They were packed into carts and carried further down the river to perform the next evening. Potemkin had spared no cost. At the 3 anchorages along the river, he had built a splendid new palace with every luxury. Each was adorned with a man-made waterfall, a park shaded by transplanted trees that withered and died after Catherine had departed. Leaving the river, the Empress traveled by carriage through villages alive with industry and smiling crowds. She had no way of knowing that Potemkin had whisked in every peasant for miles around to flesh out his roadside landscape. Catherine laid the cornerstone of a cathedral whose plans made St. Peter's in Rome look like a chapel. At Kherson, she viewed from afar a huge new fortress. At Sevastopol, while 180 musicians played at dinner, she looked out over the harbor at her new Black Sea fleet of warships. Potemkin had built the fleet in 2 years. The deck guns fired a salute. The climax came at Poltava. Potemkin staged a mock battle that reenacted the victory of Peter the Great on the same ground. Catherine went back to her capital, singing Potemkin's praises. The Crimea had been turned into the pride of all of Russia. She died without ever learning that the beautiful land was an invention of the man she loved and who loved her, and the greatest hoax in history.